Welcome to our HCRI seminar titled Humanitarian Extractivism, the Digital Transformation of Aid. I am delighted to welcome my friend and colleague and research collaborator for the past 5 years, Professor Kristin Bergtora Sandvik. So she is a research professor in humanitarian studies at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, PRIO, and also a professor of the Sociology of Law at the University of Oslo. She's a socio-legal scholar with a particular interest in the politics of innovation and technology in the humanitarian sector. And that's what she's going to be speaking to us today, in part focused on her recently published book by Manchester University Press. So she holds a law degree from the University of Oslo and a doctoral degree from Harvard Law School. She has been at the forefront of thinking really about humanitarian innovation and writing about experimentation in the sector for a long time. We met, I think you're going to talk about that, about 15 years ago, 12, okay, phew, 12 years ago. So today she's going to be talking about some of the work that arises out of the project that we were on together, that Kristin led, around digital bodies, digital dead body management. So there's a term if you want to ask her about it. Also humanitarian ethics and experimentation. So I will turn it over to you for the talk, and then we'll have Q&A afterward. And also welcome to those of you who are joining online. Okay, over to you, Kristin.
Thank you, Larissa. So, hi guys, and thank you all for having me, and thank you for coming today. And thank you to Manchester University Press for actually publishing the book. So I'd like to extend a special thanks to Larissa, because a couple of years ago, I was presenting my idea for the book, and I had this idea, and then, the Zoom went quiet, and then she said, this is going to be great, but it's not going to be like this. So I changed everything, and this is the book we have here today. I've given sort of the talk, the heading, where are we going? Simply because this book is a little bit kind of a story about what happened, what's been going on the last 15 years. And we've been sitting around and, being amazed by what the cell phones could do, what the drones could do or not, what about the blockchain, what about AI? For you guys, when you go out working, you're not going to be amazed of stuff appearing. You're going to be struggling in what we can do with this. I mean, you've always seen this. This has always been part of your education, your horizon, the work you've done in the field, maybe already, but also, understanding well that this is opportunity, but it's also risk. So in a way, this is kind of I've been doing aid work since I was 20. This is back in the 90s. I mean, I was at the tail end of kind of Rwanda conflict. I was working with Bosnian refugees. This is in 1995. So this came along a little later. And I also want to extend my thanks to you guys, because it was here that I actually presented my first academic paper on humanitarian technology. So this is 2012. I've had 3 kids in 4.5 years. I'm showing up with a baby here. This is why she remembers me, because apparently it was unusual back then, but I'm here with this giant baby and trying to give a paper on humanitarian drones. But part of this was because I had a postdoc on cyber war, and it was impossible to get anything interesting going on without a security clearance, which I hadn't. So this is why I started working on humanitarian tech, but you guys were the first to sort of host one of my contributions. So it's been going on for a while, but I'm really, really happy about the collaboration with Manchester. I also want to thank, obviously, a lot of humanitarian organizations, workers, activists, private sector workers, entrepreneurs, community members, and academic colleagues for collaborating with me on this book. So all the problems with the book are mine, but I think if there's any interesting insights here, it's a collaborative type of work. I also want to say something about privilege, because I had the opportunity to go places, to be seen as an expert, to be taken seriously. As a woman, very often in academia, you are being questioned. That is also something that I've been facing, but the amount of privilege I've experienced I would like to just acknowledge here that it's opened a lot of doors for me. So what's this book really about? For my next book talk, I'm going to do better numbering of this. It's going to be a list. So a couple of things have happened. The first thing that we've seen is that aid is increasingly reordered around interventions on humanitarian data. You need to collect the data, you need to analyze the data, you need to store the data, and you need to make it into actionable alternatives of things you can do with it. And the fact that so much focus is going towards collecting the data really has a knock-on effect on how we see aid. The second new thing is that digital tools and all the data hoarding that we can now do, remember that this is a field that historically has suffered from really a lack of accessible data, a lack of information, a lack of understanding of what was happening in the next village. With all this new data, we have new spaces, we have new logics, and we have new interventions. With new spaces, I'm going to talk about humanitarian drone airspace a little bit later on. We hear a lot about how humanitarian space is shrinking, how access is getting more difficult, how humanitarian workers are under threat. In a way, this is true, but this is also true, that technology provides you with new opportunities for intervention. It also means that the private sector partners have become part and parcel of the humanitarian response in ways that were seen as hugely controversial maybe 10 or 15 years ago. Also, we have a lot of actors that are not classically understood as humanitarian. So the World Bank, for example, UN Habitat, suddenly declared themselves to be humanitarian about 7 years ago. And then you have a lot of startups that would like to be seen as doing morally good work, and then they call it humanitarian, and they sort of sell their services on humanitarian markets. So a lot of change has been going on. The digital body. We all have digital bodies, you know, like your phone knows more about you than your mom, obviously. But there's a difference here. If you would like to have legal protection, if you are seeking shelter, if you are in need of food assistance, you have to give away data, all your biodata, your biometrics, to get that protection, which means that we see the sort of creation of the digital body. I'll get back to this. And this digital body is needed for humanitarian organizations. They can no longer register people who don't want to give up their data. So this has become sort of the focus for both protection and care and control. This, however, means two things. The first is that it's multidimensional risk. So obviously communities are at risk of hacking, but so are humanitarians. And I'll speak about this a little later, but it's not only that we can compromise the people we try to assist, but also that we become vulnerable in terms of where we are, in terms of our private communication, in terms of being subjected to pressure, for example, in terms of being hacked. And then importantly, it's not only when the technology fails that risk is arising, it's also when it succeeds. You know, when if you do an amazing job of collecting all the biometrics you can, the amount of biometrics you collect, that sort of hoarding might also become a problem. As we saw when the coalition forces had to leave Afghanistan very quickly and left a lot of data behind. That was a very, very large database. Which leads me to the last point. So a lot of these huge NGOs, but also UN agencies have built these advanced databases. This means that, you know, vulnerability is being centralized. So back in the day where you had some data here and some data there, it wasn't fantastic, but it meant you didn't construct this giant target that we are now faced with. So High Commission Refugees has one big database. The UN Organization for Children has one, the World Food Program has one, and in a way, you know, they provide a target for potentially hostile attackers. So these are kind of my 5 things. So why talk about extractivism? This wasn't actually my idea. It was the first reviewer who told me this was going to be a book about extractivism. You know, every single chapter was about extracting data from people who didn't have any say. And then I said, yes, okay, fine. But it was a good idea. And it's really helped me. So I want to acknowledge the reviewer. You know, why do we talk about this now? The first thing is, you know, who gets what? I think I've already sort of laid out the importance of data relations. There isn't the golden age, when things were better and we had pen and paper. I did work for UNHCR and the resettlement unit 20 years ago, actually. Like the files were lost. You had coffee and spilled your coffee in the Sudanese files. Someone else left her on these files in the back room. Some files were stolen. The Congolese files were locked in a cupboard. Nobody could find the key. I mean, it was chaotic, right? It wasn't fantastic. It wasn't like having paper really provided with security. It was disorganized and also easy to access in a way. But the problem of sort of having everything turn into data relations means also that, you're probably familiar with the concept of data capitalism, surveillance capitalism, data colonialism. Humanitarian interventions are not happening in sort of an equal space. If you want to live, if your family is going to eat, you will give up your data. So we're all, as I said, we're all digital bodies, but this kind of context of inequality really matters. But this cannot only be reduced to surveillance capitalism. And this is the icky, sticky part for me. This is also because we're collecting data from people who are really suffering, right? And if they didn't suffer, humanitarians wouldn't really have any currency to get funded to do their work. So it's that extra dimension of suffering which compounds the power inequality. The second is what I call the decline of stuff. Historically, we were, humanitarian aid was about, going out in the field and handing over buckets or, food rations. So I think the Americans now, since the last 3 days, they say we've dropped like 38,000 meals over Gaza. Thanks. Increasingly, we're now focusing on data valence, collecting data, that sort of cycle of mapping out things and data extraction. And this is important because historically we gave things. It was one directional, but now it's become this cycle. So when humanitarians give something, they also give something back. I can give you an iPad so your child can go to school, but with that iPad comes a lot of data, edtech, floating back to the provider, floating back to the private sector actor who provides the technology. So it's more cyclical. And this is what I mean with data valence. The third one is neo-extractivism. So this is a term for those of you familiar with Latin America. Extractivism is about extracting natural resources in a context of not necessarily armed conflict, but social unrest, social inequality. So it's from mines, it's building plantations, it's extractive agriculture. Part of the kind of role of humanitarianism is to not end conflict, because politics has to end conflict, but it is to provide enough food, enough shelter, get enough control over the health situation that things are getting stabilized. So we have the stabilizing impact, which allows private sector actors to move in and engage in this sort of natural resource extractivism. And this is why I've been wondering and trying to use this topic of extractivism. And the third one is experimentation. This is a field where a lot of people have solutions that are looking for problems. I mean, my favorite one is the guy who discovered or developed the edible drone. So he had this edible drone that he was going to send out to starving populations so they could eat his drone. I mean, for me, this is like the worst innovation ever. I mean, it's disrespectful. Everything is wrong with this. But unfortunately, experimentation is really part and parcel of this story. So historically, colonial countries have, gone out, tried and tested their experiments on their colonies. So this was called technological imperialism, for example. You would try out agricultural experiments, you would try out new technology, you would even try out vaccines, for example. So this is kind of the story in which humanitarian actors finds themselves when they go out and try out new technology. I've seen a lot of very, how can I say this, surprising behavior by humanitarian actors as they bring their new technology and also the private sector actor to the field. It's untested. They don't have protocols. It hasn't been standardized. It's an insecure context. There's no real way of measuring success, and they still decide to fly that drone, for example, over an urban space. So experimentalism is also a big part of the extractivism. So it's unfair data relations, it's this data surveillance. It's about extracting for other purposes than necessarily providing aid, and it's about experimentation. So this is sort of the backbone of this book. This is basically a table of contents, but I'll sort of walk through this in a way that makes sense, hopefully. I've talked now about the digital bodies quite extensively, but I just want to give you sort of a better feel of what this is really about. So in 2018, an UNHCR official tweeted a photo of an Iraqi refugee girl holding a piece of paper with all her personal data, including family composition and locations. UNHCR was inundated with criticism of the stunning indifference and perhaps also ignorance displayed by a high-ranking UN communications official with respect to a child's personal data. I mean, this official really had to apologize, and it was very shameful. But it was also kind of surprising that people were so upset, right? I mean, but this is really the first example I've seen of kind of a collective response to what would previously have been perfectly acceptable behavior by UN officials. The thing is that we have now reached the stage where it's the intervention relies on data, and protection relies on data, but it's also putting people at risk. So the first chapter is basically trying to set out the theoretical framework for understanding this concept. And just to put this as in context, I'm not saying that this is, how can I say this? We all do this. In writing this book, I heard a story from the Norwegian Refugee Council about night raids. Do you know what night raids is? So historically, it's a problem when you have development aid, you have food aid enough for 1,000 people in your camp. 1,000 people in the camp, but the day you're handing out the food aid, you have 5,000 people showing up. You haven't actually seen 4,000 of them before. This means that it's going to be very difficult for you to hand out that food to kids, for example, or pregnant women or sick people. You need to prioritize, but it's also because your donor is getting very impatient with your sort of continuous request for food for 4,000 people you hadn't registered. So night raids is also described in actually UNHCR handbooks. It's in the middle of the night, you and your team at 3 a.m., you go out and you have armrests. Bracelets that you slap on. And you tell everyone to come out of their compounds, their huts, their tents, and you slap this bracelet on everyone who shows up. Voila. So at 8 a.m. when you're handing out the food, only people with bracelets will get fed. And it's not a fantastic way of treating people, right? There's also this historical practice of herding people into enclosures, a bit like they were cows. Also not fantastic, right? So we need to remember this. On the other hand, in this very deeply unequal sort of encounter between humanitarians and people, it stopped there. The problem with the digital bodies is that it keeps living, right? It keeps sort of traveling. So UNHCR, when they are asking US to do resettlement, the US takes all the biodata of every single resettlement candidate and store it, even for people, and they keep it, even for people who are not resettled. UNHCR, once you're registered as a refugee, it's very difficult for you to change the biodata. You know, I had another kid, my kid died, I got divorced, something happened. It's very difficult to change information that's wrong. And when you're no longer a refugee, you can't actually get it deleted. One reason I worry about the digital body is that we're also seeing something else happening with technology, and that's DNA. This is sort of the next chapter. But increasingly, for migration purposes, you see people's DNA being taken and pulled into databases and analyzed also by very unprofessional labs, no sort of shared standards, and difficult to manage how data travels between humanitarian databases and criminal databases, for example. So what's the difference in this sort of next step? It's simply that DNA does something else. So biometrics doesn't tell you who your mom is. Doesn't tell anyone who's your uncle is. DNA slot you into this permanent global network, past, present, future term. So it can find your relatives in the US you didn't realize you had, but it can also find your cousin, the war criminal, somewhere else in the bush. But it's a very different sort of way of portraying people's digital bodies. So we do this a lot, right? With 123me and Ancestry.com, but we choose to do it as customers. So I'm just saying that this is sort of an ongoing development in the humanitarian field. The second chapter is about the Red Cross. So we all love the Red Cross. The ICRC is the most loved actor in this field. I also love MSF, but I love the Red Cross. It's very difficult not to. I mean, they are doing better work than anyone else. They've been taking technology development more seriously than anyone else, and they really, really tried to develop standards. I went to an event last month, and there was a woman there from another NGO, and she says, you know, it's a little difficult for the rest of us because, you know, if we tell the host government, if the host government shows up and says, we want your data, give it to us, we have to give it. But if the Red Cross says, no, you have to understand, we can't share this, the host governments usually go, no, we understand, you can't share this. So this organization is treated differently than anyone else. However, I'm going to just find my site here. In January 2022, it was discovered that there was a leak in a database called Restoring Family Leaks. This was partly due to something that hadn't been patched a couple of months before. And the ICRC exclaimed that they were outraged about how this had happened, had somebody had really hacked them to attack the most vulnerable. You know what we said? Me, Bradley there, Fast, Sandvik, usually very critical, very strong opinions about, you know, UNHCR losing data. We said nothing. Our colleagues who are usually the toughest critics in the field made sad faces and said, that's appalling, that's just horrible. So the scandal, to me, wasn't really that this happened, because we know this happens, everyone gets hacked. The scandal was more sort of the lack of criticism, the lack of critical thinking around this incident. So I've been writing this chapter, and it's interesting to write this chapter. It hasn't been so easy for the ICRC to accept that this chapter has been written. They thought it was indiscreet. I mean, I have to say, if you read it, you can have the PDF. It's fairly low-key, not so critical chapter. I'm trying to be fair and balanced, but I think for an organization that gets very little critical attention, it felt a bit rough. But the point in this chapter isn't necessarily that they didn't do their job. The point is actually the nuts and bolts of what happened. So after the Second World War, you know, millions of people displaced, families are, you know, split. Some people are, you know, rapidly moved to Canada, to Brazil, to other locations. People are looking for each other. So the ICRC has this central tracing agency that, you know, helps families get reunited. This is today, has been for the last couple of decades, the only sort of shared program activity between National Red Cross societies, the IFRC, the Federation, and the ICRC. It's called Restoring Family Links. So I will sit in Norway and I will file out a form, submit it to the Norwegian Red Cross, the Norcross. I'm Kristin Sandvik. I lived in this village. My mom was this, my dad was this, my dad's employer was this. We lived in this street. There was a bakery, there was a school, here was a mosque, the synagogue, the church. I'm looking for so-and-so, last seen so-and-so. So in this submission, I would put in a fair amount of data about me, about a lot of other people, and about the person I was looking for. And then it would be submitted, and hopefully I would find, you know, my missing family. In the late 1990s, it's sort of falling into decline, this service. I mean, back then it was sort of on paper, it wasn't digital, but people are getting their own cell phones. The organization isn't really, you know, being sought out. It's no longer providing unique service. So a couple of things happens in the organization. First, they start being very interested in being a leader in technology. And they also start being very interested in migration, which you would think wasn't necessarily a topic for a strictly humanitarian mission organization. So they build up a database, a global database, and they also keep working on migrants, including migrants without an official status. So when you get to the time of the hack, they have a database with millions of names, with a lot of users. 500,000 users had their data compromised. And I've been struggling a little bit to understand whether that's, all of us submitting requests, or whether that's counting everyone who's also mentioned in those requests. And as I understand, this is just the people who actually submitted the requests. So the number of people actually being compromised is probably much, much larger. So they were hacked, and they did something fairly unique. They told everyone who had been hacked that they had been hacked. I would have liked to see an apology as well. I don't think that happened. The problem a little bit with the whole sort of nuts and bolts of this is on this list, at least in my country and in a couple of other countries, there were migrants without official status who had trusted this organization. When the hack happened, they all went to the national security services to get help, because it's a national security service that helps you when you're hacked. The Red Cross is auxiliary to the government in a lot of countries. So you go off and you also hand off this list of people. I find that deeply problematic. I find it deeply problematic that we haven't had a conversation about what it means to hoard names in a way that they've done. I don't think they could have avoided. I mean, they could maybe have avoided this particular hack, but it's very difficult to stay secure. Imagine you're, the IT guy, the cybersecurity person, and you're calling up the donor and saying, this year something is going to be new. I'm going to spend 70% of my budget on cybersecurity. Then I'm going to spend 30% on salaries, and then 10% will go to communities in crisis, because then at least we can keep data safe. I mean, that's not something you can do, right? You can't actually spend all the money. But this means that vulnerability and decentralizing vulnerability, it's infinite. You can't defend yourself. And this is now a permanent feature of the field. But it's also a little bit disconcerting that we couldn't get around to have a critical conversation about this. My third one is on the power and risk and riskiness in digital humanitarian work. And this is like an example of how much things have changed. I'll tell you two stories, which are going to sound so stupid and so old to you, happened a decade ago. But this was what it was, right? People were really kind of irresponsible. So this is back in September 2014. It's in the middle of Islamic State. It looks like a global threat. The Syrian war is really maybe at its worst. Every day you hear new and sad stories about atrocities. So the Swiss humanitarian aid worker in northern Syria did a tweet, and this is when Twitter was Twitter, right? Containing the GPS coordinates of a bunker near the Syro-Turkish border, which had been seized by members of the Islamic State. So he asked the US Central Command and all followers to just blow it away. The humanitarian worker who asked for bombing is kind of unique. So in response, and this is where you guys know what happened here, right? He didn't. ISIS affiliated accounts on Twitter sent out a barrage of threatening messages saying that they were coming for Mr. Aid Worker. The worker went into hiding after the IS accounts tweeted pictures of him and his LinkedIn and Twitter accounts, claiming that he was a CIA agent who should be killed. And that was, I think, the end of his humanitarian work. It is obvious to you guys that this could happen, that IS also had Twitter accounts and knew how to find you. But this was sort of new back in the day. Another example from my book is the Australian government putting the data of thousands of asylum seekers online. It's downloaded in a lot of non-democratic countries who would like to see where their citizens have gone off to claim refugee status. And there were examples of people being sort of threatened domestically in their own countries using this data. So this wasn't a data breach. This was just sloppiness. So this is sort of a different story about dealing with data. This is how we can put ourselves and our clients or users or beneficiaries or customers or whatever you would call people on the line as well. My fourth chapter is on UNICEF's Variables for Good challenge. And this is also something, innovation challenges are kind of like so last year. You know, we had a discussion about skinny jeans going in here. It's sort of been in, but now very out for 7 years. And then it's been in again for, I don't know, 2 minutes, maybe, hopefully. Innovation challenges are out. I don't think they're going to come back in. And part of this is because they were also always kind of weird. So I started out thinking that this was a challenge where UNICEF had invited a lot of people globally to try to help out with wearables for kids. You know, how can you develop small, smart solutions that will improve health of disadvantaged kids in marginalized communities? Sounds great. The winner, I'll spoiler first. The winner was two groups won. One called Soap Pen, which had these multicolored crayons that, you know, when kids would wash, it would be colorful foam. So this is pre-pandemic, right? Like now they have to wash their hands. But this was sort of optional back in the day. So this was seen as a great innovation. The other one was a necklace that small kids, babies, infants would wear that would contain their vaccination records. Upon winning this competition, this became a biometric platform within like a year. It was it's called Cushy Baby. It's published somewhere else. But the winners were extremely effective in hoarding resources, winning more competitions, but ended up building a surveillance platform where they would, you know, and also these babies having these necklaces around their neck was a little dubious, but, you know, surveilling the moms, the babies, the healthcare providers, everything, with sort of no data security, data ethics involved at all. Anyhow, so I'm looking at this challenge, I'm looking at UNICEF, you know, having all these stages, all these judges, and working with their private sector arms and frog. And the more I study this, the more sort of obvious it becomes to me that this is a date. This isn't necessarily so much about innovation. This is for UNICEF, frog, and ARM to have something meaningful to do together, so they will get to know each other. It's not like Tinder, but it really is for these actors to sort of get used to each other and to find out whether they can work together. They completely lose interest in the kids about halfway through. I mean, this has nothing to do with children's rights. I would almost say quite the opposite. There's no thought given to sort of data hoarding of children's digital bodies or data security or privacy issues. And it's a fascinating sort of competition. It's also one of the many examples of there's no evaluation of this competition. If you look at UNICEF documents, they sort of close it and then they just boop. So hopefully this can be, I mean, it's the only critical analysis of this competition. But for those of you interested in innovation, there's something about the mechanics here which kind of striking. Then it's the early drone airspace. This is from Nepal. So the paper I was giving here, when I was here, it was called The Rise of the Humanitarian Drone. And it was basically about how more and more actors talked about potential humanitarian uses for drones. And this is back in the middle of the drone war. Obama had licensed humanitarian drones over Libya that would bomb the whole thing to pieces. I wrote this, it's published in Millennium. No one actually probably read the article, but I had, you know, military contractors see the title and just, do you want to come to North Dakota and talk about humanitarian drones? It's so great. So I got involved in this sort of practical work, working with UN, advising OCHA a little bit during the intervention here, but also trying to develop standards for the drone airspace afterwards. And the reason why I want to tell the story about the drones is because, you know, we keep talking about how humanitarian space is shrinking. This is a publicly unclaimed space that is now being claimed for, you know, drone traffic. You know, you've probably been through the e-scooters as well. I mean, in Norway, we had ultimate, like, complete chaos, no regulation at all. Tons of people got injured, and then they went bankrupt, and then we have some regulation. I mean, you know, I think it's unimaginable that this would happen in an urban space, you know, that you would have sort of e-scooters in the air. At the same time, the starting point for the humanitarian drones have been a little bit sort of try and fail, and a lot of strange usages. So in my chapter, I'm kind of trying to tell the early story about how this happened. And a lot of you will go to field sites where you see excellent local uses of drones, completely meaningful, very effective. Locals using the drones for things that they have devised and found the needs for. Back in the days, this was kind of different. So in this paper, I have three small stories. There is one. One is the sort of the story about kind of the colonial drone airspace. Just a weird, not fun fact is in the Zimbabwean Liberation Wars, the South Africans, for example, the Rhodesian governments were actually using drones against people who wanted to become independent. Back in the day, colonial powers were actually bombing populations who didn't want to pay tax, right? So airspace has always been used in sort of an oppressive manner. And given that the colonial past, the drone use in the colonial past has a direct link to that sort of current use of drone space. So my first example is in the book is from Malawi and some of the untested and kind of useless, hapless uses of drones, but also this sort of, that you could have innovators saying things like Africa doesn't need roads, it needs drones. Right? How are pregnant women going to get to hospital? But just the fact that people could bring themselves to say things, they would leapfrog. They don't need roads anymore. Let's just, skip all that and go directly from my drones. So there was a lot of weird discourse happening that I think would have been unpalatable today. The second one is what happened in Syria. And this is sort of more sort of strange statements that you guys are going to find interesting. So in sort of the early days of the Syrian intervention, cargo drones were much less developed than they are today. You guys have seen this as a normalized part of the Ukraine drone war. But there was something called the Syrian Airlift Project that were basically devising expensive suicide drones to go in and sort of deliver things to Syrian citizens, medical aid, food aid, et cetera, et cetera. But the idea was that this would sort of be a working network, although an expensive one. And it attracted an enormous amount of attention from the international media. Very American, very Silicon Valley, and extremely paternalistic. So the guy who was behind this startup, and I'll give him the credit, he's later on published a mea culpa in a webpage called Failury, which is a webpage publishing stories of failed innovations. But at this point, he gave the following explanation of what the Syrian Airlift Project was going to do. Just as the Berlin Airlift was a symbol of hope and an act of defiance against Soviet aggression, the Syrian Airlift Project defies those who use starvation and medical deprivation as weapons. By tapping into the magic of airplanes, it fires imaginations and offers Syrians a glimpse of hope beyond the darkness of war. After 4 years of barbaric war with no end in sight, they have little hope and their spirits are broken. With the Syria Airlift Project, we could give them something to believe in and give them direct roles in bringing healing back to their countries. This is a little bit like Live Aid. I mean, this is like 1984. It feels very old-fashioned. And people went around saying stuff like this for a long time. Anyhow, this particular project, they burned a lot of forest around Stanford and then went bankrupt. So it ended badly. But it was an example of sort of early drone activity. The third one is about Nepal. You probably haven't heard much about Patrick Meyer. He was a very prominent crisis mappers person who went in to do humanitarian drones. He's doing robotics now. He was very, very pro those drones. So in the early days of the Nepal earthquake, he talked about how all these nice digital Jedis showed up to help out with their drone. And this was interesting to sort of watch from the sidelines, because after about a week, Patrick became very upset. People were really, really misbehaving with their drones, and he just couldn't understand it. So on his blog, and I'll read again, some days later, an irritated Meyer acknowledged that the past few days have made it clear that we still have a long way to go in humanitarian drone space. These other pilots, some of them reporters and disaster junkies, have already undermined the use of UAV for humanitarian efforts. It's been reported that Nepali government was very irritated with reporters collecting disaster advantage footage using drones. The lack of regulation posed a number of challenges. Some UAV teams choose to assume that the lack of regulation meant that they could operate as they wished without seeking permission. This backfired. Several teams were arrested by the police and over a dozen UAVs were confiscated. I'll give Patrick this. After this, he became incredibly serious about convening people for developing drone ethics. So this became sort of a UAV code of conduct. It's sort of a living instrument that we never ended. It's never ended. It sort of stayed open. It's not a perfect success story, but it is a story about how this community came together and learned and relearned from problems. And then the last chapter in the book is on innovation ethics, basically everyday practice in field labs. As I was lucky enough maybe 5 years ago to be part of something called the DEC project. They had £10 million to do innovation work. £10 million is just a lot of money. I mean, I would like £10 million as well, but they worked really hard. I think I've never seen anyone work as hard as those labs did on the project. I ended up writing a couple of small things for them. And this sort of is a chapter that tries to understand what happens when you take Silicon Valley innovation paradigms and even sort of ethical paradigms and try to make those operational in global labs. So this set of innovation labs, they had people doing work in the Philippines, in Kenya, in Bangladesh, in Jordan. I think I'm missing a country now. And they were trying, and all of these sort of teams were building labs where they invited local innovators to come in and start kind of a very professional process of developing ideas, selecting ideas that could be working, putting people through boot camps, and helping them to sort of develop their skills. And it's a very interesting project. I mean, it's an expensive one, but it's fascinating. So for a lot of these labs, it was a huge problem that they would show up in the community and ask their time. And what could I offer? You know, what are you going to offer me? I'm sitting here, I'm, community member, I need stuff. No, we're not going to offer you anything. We're going to offer you capacity building. And when you have been capacity built, when you've done this, you might or might not be able to do something. And that's a very sort of shaky prospect. So what we saw over time was that a couple of different sort of conflict lines developed. That's not accurate again. I keep looking at this one, it keeps doing the same. What's the time already?
45.
So I'm done.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm done. Okay, but I'm almost done.
Yeah.
But it became a little bit difficult because they worked their ass off. I'm so impressed. But there was a difference between the labs and the innovators that are on board. The innovators were asking why they weren't salaried. And if I succeed with my innovation, are you guys in the lab going to do intellectual property on this? You know, what happens to me? And then there was a different set of problems between the innovators and the community. Because the community was sort of like, so you are, you say that you're developing this for us, but we haven't seen you since the first day when you had your photo taken with us. And, this app sounds useless. How are you benefiting us? How are we working together on this? And then, of course, it was also between the labs and the larger project. So we have all these sort of new ethical questions showing up. What does it mean to participate? How much can we ask people to work for free? What do we promise them in the end? What does it mean to scale? Does it mean to scale is that my app is going to be so successful that I can sort of, become a millionaire? Because this is public interest funding at the end of the day. The community was supposed to benefit. Is success that should I become rich in the end? Is this the end goal? So it really showcased a lot of the sort of fundamental problems with humanitarian innovation, but also the fact that, people work hard, and there are many, I would say, impressive activists and workers out there. So it's also why it's the last chapter. I'm trying to kind of be hopeful. So last week, and I'll end now, but I was doing this launch in Norway, and the Red Cross guy said, Kristin, I know you. You're trying to be fair and balanced here, but I hear you. I can see that you're really struggling to be impartial, and you're so not. So in the end of the day, this is not something we're doing for fun. No individual should be reduced to just a data reservoir for us so we can do the job better. Neither for your research, for your degrees, for my books, for the works of humanitarian actors, although we're all trying to do good and we mean well. So hopefully this book can sort of be a useful resource for you guys as you move along with your work. It's a starting point. It provides very little information about what happens next. How are we going to do this digital transformation together? And how are we going to face the very severe challenges that we are facing in the world today? There isn't enough money. It's very unclear how we can help the people of Gaza. Sudan is almost a forgotten conflict, although obviously it's not. The climate change is relentless. How can we use this to the best of our abilities? Because it is a tool that we have to use moving forward. Sorry and thank you.